Good afternoon, students. First, I'm going to start off today by telling you a little bit about who I am and why I'm here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the end of the Cold War and what was called the Gulf War, which is, I think, the topic of discussion for your segment in your classes. My name is Matt Weingast. I was Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Army. I served for 24 years in the Army, and I served in a variety of different capacities. I earned a master's degree in strategic intelligence and national security policy, and I completed two combat tours in Iraq and 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. When I was about your age, I was somebody who loved sports, had a strong desire to serve my country and to be part of a team. I really enjoyed being part of a team. And I went to college and I played Division I sports in college, and I joined Army ROTC. In 1987, I just went onto active duty in the Army as a lieutenant, and my first assignment was as a scout platoon leader. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, what that means in a minute. Why am I here? Well, my military career provides me with some very unique perspectives and experiences relating to the events that you are studying about now. And my purpose is to help you to try and understand the events that occurred and perhaps help clarify some questions that you may have, and perhaps help you appreciate the lessons that we all should take from history. I also think it's important that others get an opportunity to hear the stories and the experiences of courage and patriotism of the real heroes with whom I served. So to me, the men who didn't make it home are the ones who I think are the real heroes, and they don't get to tell their story. So by you listening to me here today, it helps me to provide me with an opportunity to tell their story and honor them, frankly. So thank you very much for allowing me to do that. That's the first and foremost reason why I think it's important to do these sorts of things. So my first assignment in the Army was as a scout platoon leader, as I said, in a place that used to be called West Germany. And our job was to patrol what we called the Iron Curtain in Europe. And this is where when the Soviet Union was a country, and there was a real concern that the Soviet Union would try and invade Europe and take over the Western world. And my unit's job was to provide the early warning. We were the tripwire, right? We were there to stop the Russian advance and alert the Western world in case the Russians did advance. This job of scouts is to find the enemy in an offensive posture and in a defensive posture to alert and provide early warning for the main bodies that are behind you. You're on the front line. Scouts are always on the very front line. There's no one in front of them that's friendly, and everybody who's behind them is their friend. So that's the job of a scout. In the summer of 1990, there was a lot going on in the world. The Cold War had dominated the environment, and the Middle East was like a powder keg, much like it remains today, with lots of countries constantly on the edge of turmoil and conflict. Iraq and Iran had finished a long, bloody war, and there was a brutal dictator in Iraq called Saddam Hussein. What happened was there was some mistaken signals that were sent by the ambassadors of the United States to signal to Iraq that they were not interested in going to war to protect Kuwait. And as a result, Kuwait, which was a pro-U.S. democracy, somewhat of a democratic country, and Iraq decided to invade Kuwait, thinking that we wouldn't do anything about it. And so what unfolded was some horrible scenes on the news where an innocent country was invaded by a neighboring force, and turmoil ensued. The Iraqi military brutally imposed their force over the people of Kuwait. And President Bush was concerned that Iraq would continue to invade south into Saudi Arabia, which of course was a very close ally of the United States and was a source of, at the time, before the U.S. really started producing our own sources of oil, we relied heavily upon the Saudi Arabian oil fields. And most of the U.S. companies and oil companies were heavily invested, and a lot of people, assets, and money invested into Saudi Arabia. So President Bush decided that this would not stand, and that he sent American forces to the Middle East to defend Operation Desert Shield, to provide a shield and defend Saudi Arabia. So my unit, my cavalry unit, we were in an armored cavalry unit, was sent to the desert in Saudi Arabia, between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, in the later parts of 1990, so right after Thanksgiving. And we were a unit that was designed to do scouting operations, reconnaissance operations in Europe. And now we found ourselves in the Middle East in a desert environment, a very different environment than what we were used to dealing with. So there were enormous challenges with picking up and going from Europe to a desert environment. To add to that, at the time, the Iraqi military was one of the largest militaries in the world, much larger than the American military. I know people don't believe that, but that is the truth. It was significantly larger, and they had modern Soviet Union-equipped forces, modern tanks, artillery, aircraft, helicopters, all the equipment necessary to wage a modern war. And they had the latest models of equipment in many cases. So when we got our orders, and at the time, there had not been a conflict besides Vietnam, which was what we would call a low-intensity conflict. We'll get to that next week when we talk about insurgency operations. But there had not been an engagement really since the Korean War and World War II, when heavy mechanized armored units clashed on a field of battle with the American military. Iraq and Iran had fought that type of war, very bloody and very horrible for both sides, but the American military had never really done it. So it really was a test. Nobody really knew what would transpire. And one of the questions I know that I was asked about was whether we were scared. And the answer is yes. And the answer is, quite frankly, our units were told that we would experience 90% casualties. That's because the scouting mission, the reconnaissance mission, is extremely dangerous. And if you think about it, it's one thing to do reconnaissance operations in a European or here in Texas, in this type of an environment where there's hills and trees and ridge lines and forests and things that you can hide behind as you maneuver to take territory and maneuver through a zone. Well, that's what you do as a scout, and you try and find the enemy. In a desert environment, it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to sneak up on somebody and to try and find them. So we were very nervous, and we were very concerned, and we knew that the casualty numbers that were predicted for us were pretty high. We got to Saudi Arabia, and our first assignment was to conduct what we call defensive screening and counter reconnaissance operations. That means that we're up on the front line, and our job is to prevent the other side from conducting reconnaissance into our territory to see what's behind the front lines. At the same time, we would conduct offensive operations, reconnaissance operations, where we would go behind their lines and try and find and see what was there. Now, we had other sources of intelligence from satellite photos and pictures, so we kind of knew what was back there, but it was our job to try and find and identify which units and what their condition was. So, in fact, I lost the first soldier that I ever had in my command or in my unit that was killed in action on February 2nd, which was well before the ground war started. And he was killed. His name was PFC Charles, Private First Class Charles Walker. Not much older than you. He was 19 years old when he was killed in action on an observation post in the middle of the desert on the front lines between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. So the air war started, and we could watch and see the devastation. When we would conduct our reconnaissance patrols, we could see the frontline troops were taking a beating from the bombings from the U.S. Air Force, and we could hear and see every night, and we can see the operation unfolding as we were conducting our reconnaissance missions. That was when we knew this was the real deal. This wasn't just training. In late February, President Bush gave the order to go from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. The air war had inflicted enough damage upon the military where our leaders thought that we could, at fairly low risk, move in and eliminate many of the most significant units in the Iraqi army called the Republican Guard units. So in late February, we were ordered to advance into Iraq to search for, locate, and identify the elite Republican Guard units of Iraq's army. That was the unit, that was the mission of my unit. Our job was to move forward and try and find these Republican Guard units. And we attacked forward for about 3 days, where it was continuous offensive operations, no sleeping. You'd sleep 20 minutes here, 15 minutes there. If you stopped for fuel to refuel the vehicles or to rearm, and you'd stop, maybe you can get some sleep there. But for about 3.5 days, we punched through the frontline units of the Iraqi forces, and it was pretty easy, to be quite honest with you. Most of those frontline units were literally devastated by horrible attacks from the air, and a lot of those soldiers and their forces were looking to surrender. So as soon as they heard or saw us, barely we'd have to fire a shot, they would surrender. And that's the way it was for the first couple of days. And we kept moving forward, and we would take so many prisoners that we didn't even stop. We literally would sometimes stop just long enough to take their rifles away and de-arm them. We'd damage or destroy or blow up the weapons, and we'd give them some MREs, some meals ready to eat, and some water. And we'd let the follow-on troops who were behind us take care of them, because we didn't want to slow down our mission. Well, on the morning of about the fourth or fifth day, the fourth day of the offensive engagement, it was a very different story that day. It was a horrible winter desert storm. So which that means is it's a sandstorms. You could barely see. You couldn't really see more than 10 feet in front of you, and it really reduced visibility. And for a scout, that's a very damaging thing to do, to lose your visibility, because you really have to be able to see what you're going into. So there's a battle. It's a fairly important battle. It's called, at the time, it was called the Battle of Tawakkana Ridge, the 73 Easting, which is the battle that me and my men were in. And it took 3 of our men, and 3 more men were killed, and 22 were wounded, some of them very seriously. This was perhaps the largest military battle that involved what we call combined arms: artillery, tanks, heavy machine guns, armored vehicles, lots of armored vehicles, air support. Those are the types of things that we call combined arms, or a heavy heavy engagement. And perhaps the last one ever in history, because it really hasn't seen anything like that since then. But that battle involved 2 very large military units. The Republican Guards fought hard, and they fought very well, actually. And we could talk about, when we talk about next week, the insurgent operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, very different campaigns, and very different battle. Sometimes, some ways worse, some ways better. When you're in military vehicle, in armored vehicles, and you're facing other armored vehicles, and those rounds coming at you are very big, and it's a very different scene than when all you're facing is machine gun fire or RPGs. Artillery rounds coming in make huge explosions and do lots of damage, and you don't have any idea when they're coming or where they're falling. So it's a very different environment. It took us about 12 hours to punch through and get through. The soldiers who were wounded and killed, it was a pretty horrific scene, to be quite honest, and it was one that you never forget. But we lost, like I said, 3 soldiers that day: Staff Sergeant Kenneth Gentry and Staff Sergeant Edwin Kuntz, and we lost PFC Walker earlier. And again, like I said, about 22 guys who were wounded. So it was a very significant operation, and it was very unique. We were one of the few units that actually faced enemy fire, return fire. And we could talk about that another time, but basically a lot of the engagements that occurred in Desert Storm, the enemy surrendered, or there were vehicles that had been abandoned, but we didn't want to risk lives, so people would fire upon and destroy the vehicles to destroy the enemy, the use of those vehicles, without taking any risk. We wouldn't get close enough to them to really do us any harm in case they were still alive or still manned. But the reality is most of those battles, they were not manned. In this particular engagement in Tawakkana Ridge, they fought to the end. Not a single person surrendered, not a single soldier surrendered on the other side, and there was about 1,500 of them. There was 150 of us, And we were so far out in front of our friendly units that really it was us versus them, and there really wasn't anybody else. With the sandstorm, they could not fly any air assets to support us. So we ended up getting some air support, which was critical to our survival that day. But for the most part, we were on our own. It took about 12 hours for the rest of the Army to catch up to us where we were, and then with heavy tank units and armored units, we were able to punch through the enemy the next morning. So it lasted from 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 26th of February until about 5 o'clock in the morning the next morning, when we considered the battle to be pretty much over. So I know I've gone a little long here, but I do want to cover the lessons learned from this operation. And so one of the first significant lessons learned that I would pass on is that, and this becomes very important as we go into next week's lesson with respect to the war on terrorism, and that is that this perspective that me and my men, this 150 man unit of cavalry unit, and one other unit next to us, which was another cavalry unit, we experienced was very different than the rest of the 500,000 troops of American troops that were over there experienced. Our experience was that these units that we faced were very effective. They were able to do their job. They fought hard, and they bloodied our nose, and they inflicted damage on us. We just had 6 Bradley fighting vehicles destroyed. 6 of our vehicles were destroyed. It was no small affair. But that was not the experience of most of my peers, most of my comrades, of the rest of the 500,000 troops that were in Iraq. Their experience was an easy victory. Their experience was that this was a big, exciting camping expedition, and very few units had any casualties, real casualties from enemy fire. And as a result, there was this sense that it was our technology, our better tanks, which won and which inflicted great damage upon the enemy, and we were invincible. So many of my peers, as I went from the rank of lieutenant and started getting promoted, were these peers of mine who had experienced a very different fight, very different war than what me and my men had experienced. We were very much the minority. Our experience was that war was very costly, and it required boots on the ground, men on the ground, to take ground from an enemy, and that an enemy who was determined to fight and had the will to fight could inflict severe damage upon even a better trained and better equipped enemy. And that was the lesson that we learned. But those were 2 very different lessons, and we were in the minority. Unfortunately, the other prevailing view is what prevailed of the truth of the Gulf War. And you could read about it and you'll get that impression that the truth of the Gulf War was our M1 tanks are unbeatable and nobody can touch us. We can hit them from 3,000 meters away. They can't touch us. We can do anything we want to do from the air and control the ground by using air power. These were the lessons that were learned. That's the official lessons that were learned. I'm here to tell you that that really wasn't accurate. The other lessons are that we were not fighting against Muslims. We had Muslim forces. One of the questions I got, what it was like to see the other forces. We had Australian troops, British troops, French troops on our left and on our right and behind us, and other Arabic forces, Egyptian forces, Saudi Arabian forces. There was forces there from Jordan. So we fought with Muslims. This was not a war against Muslims. That tends to be one of the media, what the media puts out about this campaign, but it's really not the truth at all. We were there to defend and liberate a Muslim country from another Muslim country, but nonetheless, that's what we were there for. 2 more lessons that I think are important, even though I've gone way over time here. One is that Americans do not have the stomach for casualties. We know, those of us who've been there, that the media will turn on us very quickly if things are not completed fast and easy. And what it means by easy is low casualties. And soon after the media turns on you, the politicians will turn on you. And what I mean by turn on you is they will say, this is too costly, we've lost too many lives, it's not worth it. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether it is or isn't worth it. I'm just here to tell you that that is a reality, that is a lesson learned that we as American military fighting forces understand. We understand that that is where the world we live in. If you can't do it quickly, then it's going to be very costly and you will lose popular support very quickly. The other and last lesson is that we did not truly understand the role of Islamic fundamentalism within Muslim nations and the degree to which those Muslim nations relied upon Islamic fundamentalism to help maintain control and security over the population. And that is a key component of the world affairs in that part of the world that we probably didn't fully appreciate and understand back in 1990. So those are some of the most important things that I think that to take out of my experiences. Obviously, I could talk a whole lot more about it. It's something that is very complex and hard to cover in 10 minutes, and I've gone over by 10 minutes. So anyway, if you have any questions to this, please provide your questions to your teacher, and I'll do my best to get back to you in some fashion and get answers to your questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, I hope you found this interesting and informative. And if you ever have any questions, be sure to reach out to your teacher and they'll get back to me. Have a great day.